A single slap echoed through the bar, glasses stopped midair, conversations died instantly, and even the music seemed to lose the courage to continue. No one moved, not because they didn't care, but because everyone in that room knew exactly who had done it, and more importantly, what he was capable of. The man who threw that slap wasn't just angry. He was feared in a way that made grown men lower their eyes and swallow their pride. The kind of man people avoided without needing to be told. The kind of man no one challenged because they had all seen what happened to those who tried. And the person he hit wasn't who anyone expected. Not someone loud or reckless. Not someone looking for trouble, but a young bartender, quiet, polite. The kind of person who remembered your drink before you asked and smiled like she meant it. The kind of person you assumed life had been gentle with. The kind of person no one thought twice about until that moment froze everything in place. But what happened next didn't look like fear. It didn't look like shock, and it certainly didn't look like weakness, because as the room held its breath and every eye stayed fixed on her, something shifted in a way that no one could quite explain yet. Something that made the air feel heavier, like the story everyone thought they understood had just changed direction without warning. Because that moment would uncover a past no one saw coming, a history carefully buried beneath quiet routines and polite smiles, a story that stretched far beyond that bar, beyond that town, into places and experiences that had shaped her into something far stronger than anyone there could have imagined. And if you were standing in that room, watching it unfold in real time, you might have thought it was just another case of a bully going too far, another moment that would pass and be forgotten. But you would have been wrong, because what happened in the seconds after that slap would ripple outward in ways no one in that room was prepared for. Not the men who turned away, not the ones who pretended not to see, and certainly not the man who had just made a decision he couldn't take back. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was this man, really? The one they all watched without looking directly at, the one whose presence alone could quiet a room before he even spoke, the one whose name carried weight far beyond the walls of that bar. In this town, he was known as Jack Mercer, and people didn't say his name loudly, not out of respect but out of habit, the kind of habit that forms when fear settles in slowly over time. Jack wasn't just another customer blowing off steam after a long day. He was the kind of man who made rules without ever writing them down, the kind of man who decided who stayed comfortable and who didn't. And over the years, no one had really challenged that. Not because they agreed with him, but because they had all seen enough to understand how things ended when someone did. And that's why no one stepped in, not when his voice got louder, not when his patience ran thin, and certainly not when his hand moved faster than anyone could react. Because stepping in didn't just mean helping someone, it meant putting a target on your back. And in a place like this, that was a risk most people weren't willing to take. And then there was her, Emily Carter, the bartender who should have been the easiest person in the room to overlook, the one who had only been in town a short while, who kept to herself, who worked hard, smiled politely, and never gave anyone a reason to look twice. She wasn't loud, she wasn't confrontational, and she didn't carry herself like someone who had anything to prove, which is exactly why that moment didn't make sense. Because when Jack Mercer raised his hand, everyone expected the same outcome they had seen before, a flinch, a step back, maybe even an apology just to keep the peace. But Emily didn't give him any of that. She didn't react the way people expected someone like her to react, and that silence, that stillness, it didn't feel like fear. It felt like something else entirely, something controlled, something measured, like she had already seen moments like this play out before and knew exactly how they ended. So why didn't she fight back? Why didn't she shout or call for help or do anything at all? Was it fear holding her in place? Or was it something far more deliberate, something that no one else in that room could yet understand? Because what nobody in that bar knew, not the regulars who came in every night, not the ones who had watched Jack Mercer build his reputation over the years, was that this wasn't the first time someone had underestimated Emily Carter. There was a history there, one she hadn't shared, one she didn't wear on the surface, but one that had shaped the way she stood in that moment, calm and unmoved while everything around her seemed to hold its breath. And before the night was over, before the tension in that room had a chance to settle, everything they believed about power, about fear, about who really held control, was going to change in a way none of them would forget. Jack Mercer didn't become that kind of man overnight, and in a town like this, people always knew exactly when the shift happened, even if they never spoke about it out loud. Years earlier, he had been just another name, another face passing through the same streets, but something changed when people realized he wasn't interested in fitting in. He was interested in taking control. It started small, a disagreement here, a threat there, the kind of moments people brushed off at first, until they noticed a pattern forming, until they saw that those who crossed him didn't just lose arguments, they lost business, lost connections, sometimes even left town entirely. Over time, Jack Mercer built something that didn't need to be announced, a quiet system of influence where people adjusted their behavior without being told, where bartenders served him first without being asked, where conversations shifted the moment he walked in, and where eye contact became something people avoided not out of respect, but out of instinct. No one reported him because reporting meant standing alone, and Jack had made sure no one ever felt strong enough to do that, not when everyone else was choosing silence. He became a regular at the bar not because he needed a place to drink, but because it was the perfect place to remind people who he was, a public space where his presence carried weight, where every small interaction reinforced the same message without a single word needing to be said. People laughed a little quicker at his jokes, stepped aside a little faster when he moved, and pretended not to notice when his tone turned sharp or his patience ran thin. It wasn't loyalty that protected him. It was routine, the kind of routine that forms when fear settles in deep enough that it starts to feel normal. And Jack understood that better than anyone. He didn't need to raise his voice often. He didn't need to prove himself every night, because his reputation did the work for him long before he ever walked through the door. Emily Carter, on the other hand, arrived without any of that history attached to her name, and maybe that was why no one paid much attention at first. She was new, just another face trying to find her place, someone who kept her head down and focused on the job, someone who greeted customers with the same steady tone and never gave anyone a reason to remember her beyond the drinks she served. She was quiet in a way that didn't draw concern, respectful without being distant, and careful with her words in a way that made people assume she was simply trying to avoid trouble. But if you watch closely, really watch the way she moved behind the bar, the way her eyes tracked the room even when her hands were busy, you would notice something that didn't quite match the picture everyone had formed in their minds. There was something about Emily that didn't fit the role people had assigned to her, something in the way she observed without starring, in the way she listened without reacting, like she was taking note of things others ignored. She didn't just serve drinks, she watched people, studied them in quiet moments, in passing glances, in the way they spoke when they thought no one was paying attention. It wasn't curiosity, not in the usual sense. It felt more deliberate than that, like she was piecing something together, like she had learned somewhere along the way that understanding people was a kind of protection. And when tension built in the room, when voices got louder or movements sharper, she didn't rush to intervene or retreat. She simply adjusted, steady and controlled, as if she had already seen how situations like that could unfold. Most people didn't notice it because they weren't looking for it. They saw what they expected to see. A young bartender doing her job, staying out of the way, trying not to get involved. But there were small moments, easy to miss unless you were paying attention, where her expression didn't match the situation, where her calm didn't look like uncertainty, but like experience. As if whatever was happening in that bar, whatever tension Jack Mercer brought with him every time he stepped inside, It wasn't new to her. As if she had seen worse, dealt with worse, and learned something from it that no one else in that room could yet understand. And that's what made that moment, the moment of the slap, feel so different once you looked back on it. Because it wasn't just about what Jack Mercer had done. It was about who he had done it to, and how little he actually knew about the person standing in front of him. By the time the sun had disappeared behind the low buildings on the edge of town, the bar had already settled into its usual rhythm, a steady flow of quiet conversations, clinking glasses, and the familiar comfort people came for at the end of a long day. It was the kind of place where nothing was supposed to change too quickly, where routines mattered, and where people knew exactly what to expect the moment they walked through the door. And yet, even in a place built on predictability, there was always a moment, subtle but unmistakable, when the atmosphere shifted, when conversations softened just slightly, when people adjusted their posture without thinking, when eyes moved toward the entrance before quickly looking away. That moment came the second Jack Mercer stepped inside. He didn't need to announce himself. He never did, but his presence carried through the room in a way that made introductions unnecessary. A few people nodded without meeting his gaze, others suddenly found interest in their drinks, and the ones who had been laughing moments before lowered their voices as if something important had just entered the space. Jack moved through the bar with the same steady confidence he always had, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, like a man who had walked that path enough times to know no one would stand in his way. He took his usual seat, the one no one else ever occupied when he was around, and rested his arm on the counter like he owned not just the chair, but everything around it. Emily Carter was already behind the bar when he walked in, moving through her routine with the same calm precision she carried every night, but if she noticed the shift in the room, she didn't show it. She finished pouring a drink for another customer, set it down carefully, and turned toward Jack without hesitation, her expression unchanged, her movements steady, as if he were no different from anyone else she served. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and it was the kind of moment most people would have broken instantly, the kind where you look away first just to avoid saying the wrong thing without speaking at all. But Emily didn't look away, not quickly, not nervously, just long enough to acknowledge him before reaching for a glass. Jack watched her in a way that suggested curiosity more than anger, at least at first, like he was trying to understand something that didn't quite fit his expectations. "You're new," he said, his voice low but carrying enough weight that the nearest conversations faded without effort. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, one that usually came with an unspoken demand for acknowledgement, for a certain kind of response people had learned to give him. Emily nodded once, simple and polite, setting the glass down in front of him. "What'll it be?" she asked, her tone even, her attention focused but not submissive. It was a small thing, almost nothing at all, but in a room like that, small things had a way of becoming something else entirely. Jack leaned back slightly, studying her, as if waiting for something more, some sign that she understood who he was, some shift in her posture that showed the same awareness everyone else carried without thinking. When it didn't come, something in his expression tightened, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for those paying attention to feel the change. "You don't talk much," he said, a faint edge creeping into his voice now, the kind that turned observations into tests. Emily didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't stumble over an explanation, didn't offer the kind of nervous laugh that usually softened moments like that. "I listen," she replied, just as steady as before, her words simple, her tone unchanged. It was the kind of answer that could have ended the exchange right there, something neutral enough to move past, but with Jack Mercer, moments like that rarely ended where they should. He leaned forward slightly now, his presence pressing into the space between them, not loudly, not aggressively, but with the kind of pressure that made people uncomfortable even before they understood why. Around them the room adjusted again, conversation slowing, eyes drifting closer without appearing to stare, the quiet awareness that something was building settling in like a weight no one wanted to acknowledge. Jack's fingers tapped lightly against the counter, a slow, deliberate rhythm that matched the way he was watching her, waiting, testing. "You should be careful," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now but sharper, like the edge of something just beneath the surface. "People around here expect a little more. Respect." It was the kind of statement that usually ended with an apology, a quick correction, a shift in tone that restored the balance he was used to maintaining. Most people would have looked away at that point, would have adjusted their posture, softened their voice, done whatever was necessary to keep the peace and avoid pushing things further. Most people would have recognized the warning for what it was and responded accordingly. Emily didn't. She stood exactly where she was, her expression unchanged, her attention steady, not dismissive, not confrontational, just present in a way that didn't bend to the pressure being placed on her. And that was the moment everything shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but in a way that spread through the room like a quiet realization no one wanted to fully acknowledge yet. Because Jack Mercer had just encountered something he wasn't used to, something that didn't follow the pattern he had built his control around. And Emily Carter, without raising her voice, without changing her tone, had just stepped into a space most people spent years trying to avoid. Most people would have looked away, apologized, or tried to keep the peace. Emily didn't, and that's when everything changed. The moment didn't explode all at once. It tightened first, like the air itself was being pulled inward, every sound in the room thinning out until all that remained was the quiet tension stretching between Jack Mercer and Emily Carter. His hand had been resting on the counter just seconds before, fingers tapping in that slow, deliberate rhythm. But now it stilled, and in that stillness, something shifted in his posture, something sharper, more deliberate. The people closest to them felt it before they saw it, that subtle change that meant the line had already been crossed, even if no one had moved yet. And then it happened. The slap came fast, faster than most could follow, a clean, forceful motion that cut through the silence with a sound so sharp it seemed to echo longer than it should have. It was loud enough to stop everything, loud enough to turn every head, loud enough to make the entire room hold its breath at once. For a fraction of a second, it felt like time lost its rhythm, like the moment stretched just enough for everyone to take it in, to process what they had just witnessed, to expect what they thought would come next. Because they had seen moments like this before, not always in the same place, not always with the same people, but enough to know how it usually unfolded. There would be a reaction, a step back, a hand raised to the cheek, a voice breaking the silence, something that restored the balance everyone understood. But that didn't happen. Emily Carter didn't move. Not immediately, not gradually, not at all. Her posture remained exactly as it had been before, her hands steady, her expression unchanged in a way that didn't match the force of what had just occurred. She didn't cry, didn't flinch, didn't even blink, and in a room where everyone was waiting for a reaction, that absence became louder than the slap itself. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with confusion, with the weight of something not aligning with expectation, something that made people shift in their seats without understanding why. Jack Mercer's hand lowered slowly, not with the confidence it had risen, but with a slight hesitation that only someone watching closely would notice. For years, moments like this had followed a pattern, a predictable sequence where his actions were met with immediate submission, where the outcome reinforced everything people believed about him. But this didn't fit that pattern. The young bartender standing in front of him wasn't responding the way she was supposed to, and that small break in expectation began to settle into something deeper, something harder to ignore. Emily's eyes remained on him, steady and clear, not filled with anger, not filled with fear, but with something far more controlled, something that didn't rush to meet the moment, but instead held it in place. It was the kind of stillness that didn't come from uncertainty. It came from experience, from having stood in moments where reacting too quickly meant losing control. And as the seconds passed, stretching longer than they should have, the room began to feel it, that quiet shift where attention moved away from what Jack had done and toward how she was responding to it. Because in that moment, without raising her voice, without taking a step, Emily Carter had introduced something into the room that no one had expected, a kind of presence that didn't match the role she had been given. And Jack noticed it. Not all at once, not in a way he could explain immediately, but in the way his expression changed just slightly, in the way his confidence didn't return as quickly as it always had before. There was something in her stillness, something in the way she held his gaze without hesitation, that didn't feel like weakness, didn't feel like fear, didn't feel like anything he was used to controlling. It was unfamiliar, and that unfamiliarity carried a weight he couldn't immediately place. Because in that moment, standing in front of a room that had always responded to him the same way, Jack Mercer realized something was wrong. The silence that followed didn't feel like the kind people were used to. It wasn't the uneasy quiet that came after one of Jack Mercer's outbursts, where everyone simply waited for things to settle back into place. This was different, heavier, stretched thin by something no one could quite name yet. The room didn't return to normal. It stayed suspended, like every person inside was caught between what they had just seen and what they were expecting to happen next. A glass that had been lifted never made it to someone's lips. A sentence left unfinished hung quietly in the air, and even those who had learned to look away in moments like this found themselves unable to do it now. Because for the first time, the reaction they were waiting for didn't come, and without it, the entire balance of the room began to feel unstable. Emily Carter still hadn't moved. Not in the way anyone expected, not in the way that would allow the moment to pass and be forgotten. Her calm didn't fade, didn't crack under the weight of what had just happened, and that stillness started to draw attention in a way her quiet presence never had before. People began to look at her differently, not just as the bartender behind the counter, but as someone holding something they didn't understand. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the focus began to shift away from Jack Mercer and toward her, toward the person who wasn't reacting the way the situation demanded. Jack felt it before he fully understood it, that subtle shift in the room where the control he had always relied on started to loosen. He straightened slightly, his expression tightening in a way that suggested he was trying to regain something that had slipped without warning. For years, moments like this had ended quickly, the outcome always reinforcing the same message. But now there was a hesitation, a break in the rhythm he had come to depend on. His eyes stayed on Emily, searching for something familiar, some sign that would restore the order he was used to, but it wasn't there. And that absence began to settle into something deeper, something that made his confidence feel less certain than it had just seconds before. For the first time in years, Jack wasn't in control. Around the room, people began to shift, not physically at first, but in the way they were thinking, in the way they were watching. Confusion settled in quietly, spreading from one person to another, because nothing about this moment matched what they had come to expect. A few exchanged glances, subtle and quick, as if trying to confirm that what they were seeing was real, that the lack of reaction, the stillness, meant something more than they could immediately explain. And then, almost like a ripple moving through the crowd, something else began to surface, something quieter but far more significant: recognition. It started with one person, sitting a few seats down from the bar, someone who had been watching closely from the moment Jack Mercer walked in, someone who hadn't looked away when the tension began to build. There was a shift in his expression, small but noticeable, like a memory had just connected with something in front of him. He leaned slightly toward the person beside him, his voice low enough that it didn't carry far, but enough to spark curiosity in those closest. The words weren't clear to everyone, but the reaction was a subtle widening of the eyes, a second glance at Emily that carried more weight than the first. From there it spread, quiet whispers, barely audible, moving from one person to another, each repetition adding a little more uncertainty to the room. People began to look at her differently now, not just with curiosity, but with a growing sense that they had missed something important, something that had been there all along but hadn't been obvious until now. Jack noticed it too, not the words themselves, but the change in how people were reacting, the way attention was shifting, the way the room no longer revolved around him in the way it always had. Emily didn't acknowledge any of it, didn't turn to address the whispers or the glances, but there was something in the way she stood there, steady and composed, that made those quiet rumors feel less like speculation and more like the beginning of something being uncovered. And as those fragments of recognition continued to move through the room, one thing became clear, not all at once, but in a way that settled slowly into everyone present. The young bartender standing behind that counter was not who they thought she was, and whatever history she carried into that moment, it was about to change everything they believed about what had just happened. The whispers didn't stay quiet for long, not because anyone wanted to draw attention to themselves, but because once a realization begins to take shape, it has a way of moving through a room whether people intend it to or not. The man who had leaned in first, the one who seemed to recognize something others had missed, kept his eyes fixed on Emily Carter, his expression no longer uncertain but measured, like he was confirming something he hadn't expected to find here. "That's her," he murmured, just loud enough for the person beside him to hear. And that was all it took for the tension in the room to shift again, this time not with fear, but with understanding beginning to form in pieces. At first, it didn't make sense to most of them. The idea that the quiet bartender they had seen night after night could be anything more than what she appeared to be. But the longer they looked at her, the more the details began to settle into place. The way she carried herself, the way she had held her ground without hesitation, the way her eyes never once left Jack Mercer even after the slap. Those weren't the reactions of someone overwhelmed or uncertain. They were controlled, deliberate, practiced in a way that didn't come from ordinary experience. And slowly, as the whispers connected, the picture became clearer. Emily Carter wasn't just a bartender. Years ago, in a place far removed from this quiet town and its unspoken rules, she had been something entirely different. She had worked in environments where moments like this didn't unfold with witnesses holding their breath. They unfolded with consequences that came fast and without warning. She had been trained to read people the way others read words, to recognize intention before it turned into action, to stay calm when everything around her demanded a reaction. Men like Jack Mercer, men who relied on intimidation and control, were not unfamiliar to her. In fact, they were exactly the kind of men she had spent years dealing with, the kind who believed power came from fear, the kind who thought silence meant weakness. The difference was, in her world, that belief didn't last long, because she had been the person called when situations escalated, when control needed to be taken back. When people like Jack crossed lines they couldn't return from. She had seen how those stories ended, not once, not twice, but enough times that the pattern had become clear, enough times that she understood something no one else in that room fully grasped yet. That power built on fear only works until it meets something stronger, something that doesn't respond the way it expects. And now, standing behind that bar, with the entire room beginning to see her in a different light, that history wasn't hidden anymore, not completely. It wasn't something she announced or explained, but it was there, in the way she stood, in the way she didn't rush to react, in the way her presence had begun to shift the balance of the room without a single raised voice. Jack Mercer felt it more than anyone, even if he couldn't yet put it into words, because the confidence he had walked in with was no longer untouched. The person he had just struck wasn't who he thought she was, and the situation he believed he controlled was no longer his to dictate. In that moment, as the weight of that realization settled in, one truth became impossible to ignore. Emily Carter had faced men like Jack before, men who relied on fear to define them, men who believed they understood power because no one had ever challenged it in a way that mattered. And every time, she had been the one to remind them that they didn't. Jack Mercer stood there longer than anyone expected, his hand no longer raised, his presence no longer filling the room the way it had when he first walked in. The silence that surrounded him now felt different, no longer shaped by fear, but by something he couldn't control, something that had shifted without his permission. For years, he had relied on the same pattern, the same reactions, the same quiet compliance that followed every move he made. But this time, that pattern had broken, and in its place was something unfamiliar. His eyes stayed on Emily Carter, searching for the reaction he had expected, the one that would restore the balance he understood, but it never came. Instead, what he found was steady, unwavering calm, the kind that didn't challenge him openly, but didn't give him anything to stand on either. Around them, the room began to settle, not back into what it had been before, but into something new, something quieter but far more certain. The people who had once avoided looking at Jack now watched openly, not with defiance, but with a clarity that hadn't been there before. The weight he carried into the room had shifted, not gone entirely, but weakened in a way that couldn't be ignored. And Jack felt it, in the way the silence no longer worked in his favor, in the way his presence no longer commanded the same response. He adjusted his stance slightly, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but enough to signal what everyone was beginning to understand. This wasn't his moment anymore. Without another word, without the force or certainty that had defined him for so long, Jack stepped back. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was clear. The kind of step that didn't just create distance, but acknowledged something had changed. He reached for his coat, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if each action carried a weight it hadn't before. No one stopped him, no one needed to, because the moment had already said everything that mattered. As he turned and walked toward the door, the room didn't shrink around him the way it used to, didn't bend to accommodate his presence. It simply watched, quietly, as the man who had once controlled the space moved through it without the same certainty he had walked in with. Emily Carter remained behind the bar, exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. She didn't follow him with her eyes, didn't acknowledge his exit in any outward way, because she didn't need to. Whatever needed to be understood had already been made clear. The balance that had existed in that room for years had shifted, not through confrontation, not through force, but through something far more controlled, something that didn't rely on noise or aggression to make its point. That night no one cheered, no one clapped. There was no celebration, no sudden burst of relief, just a quiet understanding settling into the space where tension had once lived. People returned to their drinks slowly. Conversations resumed in low voices, but nothing felt exactly the same as it had before. Because something had changed, not just in that moment, but in the way they saw it, in the way they understood who held power and why. Fear had always been the unspoken rule in that room, the force that shaped behavior without needing to be explained. But that night, it met something it couldn't influence, something that didn't respond the way it expected. And in that quiet, controlled moment, without a single raised voice or dramatic display, it lost. What would you have done in that situation? Do you think Jack Mercer deserved what happened? Or would you have handled it differently? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, subscribe for more real-life stories, and there's another one you don't want to miss.